Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I want to do a video discussing the dark visions that exist in the short stories of Thomas Ligotti, particularly his first volume of published stories, Songs of a Dead Dreamer from the 1980s. And this volume also has Grimscribe, his second volume, and a particularly grotesque and hideous cover. I was trying to keep it face down as I was reading it the past couple weeks. But Ligotti is writing in weird, speculative fiction, but his stories are extraordinarily dark. And they posit life, I think, as a cosmic mistake rather than a cosmic accident. And that's an idea I'll try to return to in the video. But I think that's an important distinction. He's firmly standing on the shoulders of writers like Edgar Allan Poe, HP Lovecraft. But he takes his stories and he places them in such a realistic world, such a realistic feeling, human feeling world, that there's a visceral impact to his stories. Not unlike Shirley Jackson's horror stories, which are so effective because they feel like they could be they're happening to real people. There's something supernatural, something weird, something otherworldly happening in the story, but at the same time, it feels like it's happening to people and to the consciousness of characters, not just cardboard cutouts. So he's a very effective writer, but deeply, deeply disturbing and horrifying. His stories do not swashbuckle on the edge of existentialism the way that the characters do in Robert E. Howard, nor do they sort of kneel down in despair and just sort of fall asleep in the bog of consciousness at the edge of that black hole, the way that I think a lot of Lovecraft stories do. His stories firmly push on and just shamble straight into that black hole. And it can make for a very interesting exploration in reading, but it can also be very dark. So to give an example, when I said, he stands on the shoulders of Poe, what was I talking about? This is from The Music of the Moon. With considerable interest and some disquiet, I listened while a small pale man named Tresser told of his remarkable experience, his mild voice barely breaking the quiet of a moonlit room. It seems he was one of those who could not rest and, as a poor substitute for unconsciousness, habitually took to the streets in search of what our city has to offer by way of diversion. There are night spots, of course, where one may pass the hours until daybreak, but their entertainments soon grow stale for the perpetually sleepless, who, in any event, have no use for a crowd that is wide awake by choice. Nevertheless, there are certain individuals, and Tresser was one of them, to whom our city may disclose its nocturnal mysteries. In the absence of dreams that preserve the balance of the ordinary world, who would not be on the lookout for beguilements to replace them? Indeed, there are enchantments that nearly make amends for one's stolen slumber. And that Tresser needs a little mon in front of it, and then we can see that Poe's an influence. There are some of the stories, not many, but some of the stories that even have references to the Cthulhu mythos, or one has an epigraph from the Necronomicon. So the Lovecraft influence is not only there, Ligotti I think is admitted it's there, but he really is taking it this step further. I mentioned this idea of cosmic mistake versus cosmic accident. There are many of those writers who, in the first half of the 20th century, Lovecraft, Kafka, Howard, were all sort of pushing this idea of, life is an accident, existentialism. There's this sense of meaninglessness that exists, and they all have different ways of dealing with it. Some, like in Howard's case, they sort of try to carve out this space, in reality that is theirs, and that is the choice, this nihilistic choice to demand a space. Others sort of, particularly in Lovecraft, the characters just sort of are subsumed by the horror. There's no sense in resisting it, and so they don't, or they do for a very brief time, and then just sort of the horror. But although that's Conrad, and so there's a sense where some of Lovecraft's characters almost could fit in with the pessimism of not only Schopenhauer, but I would also say the stories of Guy de Maupassant, like La Horla. But with Ligotti, it's that life and consciousness specifically are a cosmic mistake, not just an accident. That it's not just meaninglessness, but rather that within the meaninglessness, there is a malevolence to life and to consciousness And that's a very dark direction to take things. It's certainly not my worldview as a person, as a reader, and that's why I mentioned these are fairly disturbing stories. But there is a real sense that in Ligotti's stories that life is a bad thing, that consciousness is a bad thing, that consciousness is used to construct new ways to do evil and then perpetrate that on other characters and other people. And because he manages to give us, just a glimpse of humanity within his characters, like it feels like it's happening to people. It can be a pretty intense experience to read these. But he's also weird. So some of the visions, of course, deal with weird, like cactus-shaped plants that exist in another dimension. Okay. Or, characters who are put on a mask and then the mask becomes their face, or they they see something or listen to something and it causes their eyes are taken by the creature that, did that display. And it's just really intense, brutal stories. But they're also just strange. So one deals with a character who is dreaming that as she dresses mannequins, in her dream she is dressing mannequins, and the way they're described is so strange. Such is the general background presupposed by the dream, which now begins improper. As our dummy dresser approaches her work, she is overwhelmed by an amorphous anxiety without a specific source. An awesome load of new clothes has arrived to adorn a display of mannequins. Their unclothed bodies repel her touch because, as Miss Locker explained, they are neither warm nor cold, as only artificial bodies can be. Note this rare awareness of temperature in a dream, albeit neutral. After bitterly surveying the ranks of these putty-faced creatures, she says, "Time to stop dancing and get dressed, sleeping beauties." These words are spoken without spontaneity, as if ritually uttered to inaugurate each dressing session. But the dream changes before the dresser is able to put one stitch on the dummies, who stare at nothing with anticipating eyes. And so she goes on, and then in her dream, this character that she's dreaming as falls asleep. The mannequin dresser dreams she is in her bedroom, but what she now thinks of as her bedroom is to all appearances actually an archaically furnished hall with the dimensions of a small theater. And it describes it. She perceives the objects of the scene more as pure ideas than as material phenomena, for details are blurry and there are many shadows. There is something, however, which she visualizes quite clearly. One of the walls of this lofty room is missing, and beyond this great gap is a view of star-clustered blackness. All is silent. Another odd perception to have in a dream. This silence somehow electrifies the dream with strange currents of force, betokening an unseen demonic presence. Then a new feeling enters the dream, one slightly more tangible. There seems to be an iciness drifting in from that starscape across the room. Temperature again, a rare dream indeed. Once again, our dreamer experiences a premonitory dread of something unknown. Without moving from her place on that uncomfortable couch, she visually searches the room for clues to the source of her terror. Many areas are inaccessible to her sight, like a picture that has been scribbled out in places. But she sees nothing particularly frightening and is relieved for a moment. Then her trepidation begins anew when she realizes for the first time that she hasn't looked behind her, and indeed she seems physically unable to do so. And it goes on as this character is dreaming in the place of a mannequin, and then it turns out that the storyteller is also experiencing this in life and begins to take this on into his own consciousness and feels that he is, becoming a mannequin at night, and that if he can't wake himself out of it, he will become a mannequin in real life, like a little doll in the dresser of some tormentor. And it is just so disturbing. It's Alice in Wonderland taken, with like razor blades on every page to cut at the characters, and it's brutal. So these are excellent stories that really do unsettle a reader. That said, please don't read these. If that's not the type of thing you enjoy, these will be as unenjoyable as any horror fiction can be or weird fiction can be. There are stories that involve assaults. There's at least one story that involves an attack on a child. So that the stories some of the stories can verge into the very, very, very horrifying with those types of events. But many of them are just so unsettling. So I'd be curious to know if anybody else has read any of Ligotti's stories. I had heard about him a number of years ago when the first season of True Detective came out, and there was an article on that season talking about some of the characters having sort of an ethos that felt similar to Ligotti's. But, you know, if you enjoy weird fiction, this is certainly the dark side of the moon for it. Now, I had mentioned that Poe, of course, feels like a huge influence on Ligotti. Lovecraft as well is so... It's on the page, literally. But Lovecraft is an enormous influence. Now, I had mentioned that Shirley Jackson's stories and novels can feel that way as well, where they just feel so much more realistically brutal. But another writer who achieves much is A.S. Byatt, and specifically the story Raw Material in her Little Black Book of Stories is quite astonishingly dark and horrifying. Others who come to mind: M.R. James, whose characters are almost always academics or sort of like gentlemen, armchair academics, and Ligotti's characters sometimes feel like some of them inhabit the same, you know, world as the characters of M.R. James. Kafka, of course, is a very terrifying influence as well. And then ETA Hoffman's stories, particularly The Sandman, feels like one that Ligotti might have had the page open to. I mentioned, of course, Guy de Maupassant, specifically La Horla, and I think Nietzsche is very much present in Ligotti's stories. Then two others that I read last year. One is The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor Laval, who is, I would say, more in the Robert E. Howard side, where characters are trying to resist and are trying to sort of carve out a space in this horrifying world to inhabit. But a novella that intersects with the Cthulhu mythos. And then To Walk the Night by William Sloane, a really, really strange story. One that I want to reread because it was so strange and so effective, the way it, you know, explored the weird side of, you know, those characters in that world. So let me know if you've read, again, Songs of a Dead Dreamer or other works by Ligotti. Oh, Laird Barron would be another sort of more contemporary horror writer who I think of as a peer of Ligotti, but again, not quite as dark. So this has been sort of a on the pain, not pain over joy tag, but that'll be coming next week. And a more hopeful video, hopefully, as well. But I hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.